Hello. We have been speaking about world order, and last time we spoke about India and China and some of their contributions to world order, and we noted that philosophies that are ancient, the sense of cyclical time in Hinduism is being married with India's ideas about its role in the world today, and the ancient Chinese philosophies of Confucianism and Taoism are being fused, hybridized with what remains as a distillation of Marxist thought that rules the Chinese Communist Party today, in order to bring about their sense of harmony and to realise their vision of China in the world order. And these great powers are not merely slotting into an existing world order, and we made that point, I think, repeatedly and clearly, that there is not some system like the Westphalian system, which originated in Europe, that all of these powers are slotting into a liberal international world order, but they are also moulding that world order in their own image and according to their idea of how the different peoples of the world should relate. And note, I said the different peoples, I didn't say the different nation states, because peoples from around the world have different ideas of what the basic unit is. Today, my thoughts, like so many people's in the world, is turning to America, the Western Hemisphere. We'll talk a bit about the Americas today. And at the time of this recording, the Republican National Convention has just nominated Donald Trump for the presidency of the United States. And there was Donald Trump with the bandage on his ear after the failed assassination attempt at that rally in Pennsylvania. By some miracle, by some intervention by the divine, he was spared a fatal bullet. Now, we don't want to run down the rabbit warren of conspiracy theories as to how this event came about. But in the American consciousness, there is a decided sense of providential protection and destiny for the United States. No matter where you come from in the world, with your different perspectives, and no matter what you think of the United States and its influence in the world, whether overall benign or overall malevolent, you have to acknowledge that for a great proportion of the American people, there has been this consciousness of a special role for America. It's spoken of in different terms: American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, providential guidance of the United States. Thomas Jefferson spoke of the United States as an empire of liberty, whose mission was to expand. the consciousness and the practice of liberty around the world. So this consciousness amongst the people on the continent of North America began initially in regards to the continent itself, because there were just colonies there in the beginning, concentrated on the eastern side, on the Atlantic side, but here was a continent that stretched from Atlantic to Pacific. And gradually there arose this sense that America has a God-given right to expand and fill the whole continent from east to west. There was the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, from the French, in 1803, which delivered a vast tract of land in the middle of the continent. Via Thomas Jefferson's negotiations, and then later Texas came into the Union by 1845, and there were wars fought with Mexico over that California, New Mexico area in the west of the country, and there was a deal done with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory, and gradually what we understand as the United States today was knitted together. And it included the purchase of Florida from Spain as well. So there was a time when the Spanish Empire, either directly or via Mexico, controlled large areas of the United States, just as the French did. And over the course of the 19th century, that all became part of a union. And whilst this was happening, the consciousness was rising that there was a manifest destiny. Initially, that meant the God-given right to fill the continent from east to west, to bring it all under the occupation and the cultivation and the development of essentially the Anglo settlers, largely Puritan. I'd say the Puritan influence predominated in that. In the process, the Native American people were driven off the land in many cases. There were wars fought, there were depredations, and there were many tragedies along the way. And also, the tragedy of the American Civil War followed after that continent had been taken over. Brother was fighting brother. And it had to do with slavery, of course, but it also had to do with how integrated the union was going to be. But I don't want to go down that track. I want to stick with this idea of America's special role in world history and its sense of its own destiny. After the 19th century, the term manifest destiny was taken up, but instead of applying to Americans moving across and dominating the continent, it was applied to America's mission in the world to spread its system of thought and government to other nations. This is the beginning of America becoming the policeman and law enforcer of the world. Does it have a special system? Does it have a special mission? There's no question that Americans themselves believe in that special mission. It's there on their banknotes. Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. It goes right back to Sir Francis Bacon in the around 1600 and his book, The New Atlantis. He'd conceived that there would be this new island, really a new continent, where there would be philosophical rulership. And indeed, America became the first experiment in a government by philosophical principles and a secular government. Now, in the old world, you had monarchs and emperors. In the new world, there would be a constitution, and it would be a government of laws, not men, as they said. And it would be more enlightened because of that. In a sense, it was an outgrowth of the European Enlightenment. Now, over time, we see this curious paradox. On the one hand, there's no mention of God in the Constitution. But on the other hand, we see religious liberty as a dominant principle in the American polity. And so much so that some commentators have even claimed that America is the most religious country on earth. There's a strong sense of religiosity and religious fervour. It's a paradox. Now, America, of course, had to fight its War of Independence, 1776. It cut the ties with the British. But then it had to take control not only of its own continent, but of its hemisphere, of the Western Hemisphere. And that's where the Monroe Doctrine comes in, named after a president. 1823, the Monroe Doctrine was enunciated in their Congress, basically stating that America would not tolerate any efforts of colonisation in the Western Hemisphere and North and South America on the part of any European powers. Because there were uprisings and independence movements going on in South America, especially in South America and Central America. And the concern was that overseas powers like Spain would come in and try to put down those rebellions and maintain a colonial empire. And America didn't want that. The United States didn't want that. It wanted these places to be free of any further European influence and control. And then they could have trade, and they knew where they stood with these peoples in Central and South America. So the Monroe Doctrine said, Europe, keep out of the Western Hemisphere, and in return, we won't interfere with European affairs. Now, part of that impulse carried over into what's called isolationism down the track. And we see this term being used during the World Wars, where we see countries like Great Britain trying to pull America into the conflicts in Europe, and America resisting to a large degree. And that resistance was dubbed isolationism. This tension between being drawn into the world's affairs and not being overly committed and over-involved, but minding their own business, that's existed in the American polity since the beginning. We see that same tension today with the America First movement, the MAGA movement. The MAGA movement resists the pull of involvement in global conflicts. It's wary of enmeshment in international treaties and organisations. And we've all heard Donald Trump talking about other countries pulling their weight and NATO countries properly funding NATO, which is an alliance that is sort of Atlantic based, Western Hemisphere based, but it's an attempt to lock the United States into this alliance with Europe. Since the Second World War, initially to resist communism, but then it became very threatening, oppressive to Russia after the dismantlement of the Soviet Union. But anyway, there's that America First approach to running America, which doesn't want inappropriate, unnecessary involvement, large-scale expenditure, military bases all around the world, and endless wars. And there's another globalist approach that wants a far more active participation in nation building and regime change and so on, and building international alliances, like actively seeking to build world order and bring American principles to bear in building world order. And we oscillate between the two. When George Bush was in power, those forces they were called neoconservatives. They were very hawkish about wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. People have grown quite sceptical of all of that thinking and policy in the time since. When you do have that outward turned interventionist world order building foreign policy, you're going to be dragged into conflicts and sometimes into quagmires, and you can't finish the job and you can't see daylight sometimes, like with the Vietnam War. Afghanistan for 20 years, what did it achieve? Did it stamp out Islamic fundamentalism? No. The Iraq War, which broke the country. It's not so simple trying to transplant a system from somewhere else into the Middle East. Let's hope there's the wisdom of hindsight. When such attempts are made, there's a collision of different views of world order, and that's the main reason that they fail. In fact, it gave rise to the Islamic State, which had a completely different conception of world order based on the caliphate. It didn't respect the boundaries on the map. Iraq and Syria, they were just one big caliphate that had to be ruled by a caliph. So we, just pedaling back a bit, the Monroe Doctrine kind of gave America its elbow room and its space in the Western Hemisphere. And then later, after the Second World War, around 1947, I think, Harry S. Truman enunciated the Truman Doctrine, which had to do with the checking of communist encroachment into other countries. Because it became clear that the world was dividing into two camps, sponsored by two superpowers. And the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, believed that any communist insurgencies or militias that existed in states, initially in Eastern Europe, but then later in Africa and Asia, anywhere, needed to be supported in becoming communist states. And Stalin saw the difference as between communism and capitalism. And the United States was the sponsor of any movements, any governments that wanted to maintain what they considered the democratic freedoms and a capitalistic economy. So it was a Cold War, it wasn't an open, hot war, and it was fought by proxies. And in a way, it's never ended. It officially ended when the Soviet Union came to an end in 1991. But this business of building an empire from behind the scenes by arming proxies to do your fighting for you in different parts of the world, that's gone on, continues to this day. Different American presidents and administrations have had different conceptions of America's role in the world. Like Woodrow Wilson believed that the First World War, and he was the president that was in power through that time and was present at the Versailles Peace Conference afterwards. He believed that the war was fought to make the world safe for democracy. So there's this argument out there which pertains to world order, that war was fought over democracy. That America was the cradle of democracy, and it was America's mission to spread democracy, freedom if you like, around the world. And in one way or another, in one shape or form, I think most administrations would subscribe to that. Woodrow Wilson made it quite clear. I think Theodore Roosevelt made it fairly clear that this was essentially the mission, and that one couldn't just neglect what was happening in other parts of the world. And then, of course, by the time you get to Harry Truman, it's like there is a doctrine, a basis of a policy, that communism would be resisted wherever it appeared. So America's attention and efforts are there, projected well beyond the North American continent. And then Eisenhower comes in and talks about the domino theory. If one state falls to communism, then the neighbouring one is more likely to, and then the neighbouring one, and so on. And so they can just fall like dominoes throughout Asia and Southeast Asia, for example, which helps to legitimise a war like Vietnam. Now, what's the peacemaker to make of all of this? I'm not here to diss on America's vision of its manifest destiny. I suppose Francis Fukuyama, in the end of history, believed that that manifest destiny had been fully realised when America won the Cold War, and it was a unipolar moment, and one nation's system had triumphed, and it looked for a moment like the whole world was going to be remade in America's image, and that this was right, and that this was providentially designed. But that was too simplistic. And we've gained wisdom from 1991 to the present day. We've gained wisdom, and we realise the complexity of this problem. And that if you defeat an enemy and then make it difficult for that enemy to re-enter the community of nations and to reconcile with the world, if you don't approach it in the right, friendly way, and I'm thinking, of course, of Russia, and I said this about China last time, about the need for America and China to find a basis in friendship. They've been trying since the early 70s. If you don't welcome Russia back into the fold, but instead take a suspicious and a hostile stance towards it, and weaponize NATO against it, then it's going to end poorly. It's going to end badly.
Absolutely.
So the peacemaker has to be able to apply the same principles that they apply in interpersonal relationships to the relationships between different countries and indeed between different systems. So, back to Woodrow Wilson and the First World War being about democracy. Yes, we saw the empires tumble. There were empires leading up to the 1914 to 1918 war, the war to end all wars. That's how people regarded it, like this was going to be the end. The Romanov dynasty, the empire of the Tsars in Russia, came to an end. The Ottoman Empire came to an end in that war. Modern Turkey came out the other side. The Hohenzollern Empire in Germany came to an end. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which used to be the Habsburg Empire, came to an end. And you had a whole lot of new nation states thrown out of the centrifuge. So empires broke down, and it seemed like democracy was meant to replace them. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong about monarchy and other systems of government, just as there's nothing intrinsically wrong about democracy. Every system of government whether democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, oligarchy, every system has its pros and cons. Every system has its critics. A lot of people fear democracy because it might end in mob rule and demagogues. A demagogue who knows how to pander to the lowest common denominator in disaffected people. Or wouldn't it be better to have a state with enlightened philosophers at the helm, or an enlightened monarch, law and order? Now, the real issue here is whether, or power and authority, where do they emanate from? And I'm not going down the line of Chairman Mao, who said that power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Definitely not a thought worthy of a peacekeeper. Power doesn't come from the capacity to do harm, but from the capacity to do good. It's the power of love.
And to be truthful and honest.
That's right. All the virtues are there in power, in real power. But with the question of political systems in America, it's, does power come from above? Is it conferred by the divine on rulers? Or does it come from below, from the people? And America has been a centuries-old experiment, a modern world experiment, of developing a system where power is meant to emanate from the people, from below. Now, truth be told, a real democracy does not have a bloodthirsty regicidal impulse. We've seen that in the French Revolution. When this wave of democracy was growing in Europe and then in America, we've seen some barbaric things, including regicide, the killing of monarchs, occur in Europe. And two that stand out: the beheading of Louis XVI in the French Revolution. Let's get rid of, let's cut the regime's head off. Let's get rid of monarchy altogether. And of course, the beheading of Charles I in England, when there was that reaction to monarchy and the growing in power of the Puritans. And later they had to flee to America. So there's been this antagonism against the old regime. And where there is antagonism, it's a sure indication that, when there is violent reaction, it's a sure indication that things haven't been fully worked out and understood and forgiven and so on and so forth. It's a sure indication that these countries are going to be spending hundreds of years mopping up the blood and mopping up the mess of decisions that were taken in violence. Rush them to the guillotine. Just assassinating monarchs is not enough to ensure a peaceful spread of democracy around the world. Just developing a rhetoric against autocrats or authoritarianism can cover again a violent desire to fight what is largely a fictitious enemy. Because if you're following me, I'm saying that there are many valid principles of government, and it may be wise to have an assortment. Each contributes something different to the world order. So in order to create a new world, America had to become secular. The legitimization of its power had to come from the people, we the people, not from the king and not from the Pope. Neither throne nor altar would be the foundation of political authority. And so we've seen a revolution with the American Revolution, the shot that rang out across the world, that first shot at Lexington that began the war for independence. And we've seen not only revolution happen in the political sphere, but in the religious sphere as well. But that's another story. At this point, I think I'll leave off just saying that for the peacemaker, there has to be love of the enemy. There has to be care for the opponent and the desire ultimately to reconcile with the opponent. And if you're spreading a system of democracy, you cannot have a violent regicidal impulse driving your revolution.